introduce yourselves. Tell us a little bit about what you're hearing out there right now. What is this? You know, that whole throw it in the data swamp, we'll sort it all out afterwards kind of thing. Then we'll explore that in a little bit more depth.
Absolutely, and I'm Nick Rich, and I am a data hoarder. I actually do have pretty much all of my personal emails since 1994 sitting on my computer at home. So my ability to throw stuff out is legendarily bad. And my wife also complains about my world-class collection of Ethernet cables and so on, which take up most of our utility room, right? So data hoarding, I think, is a problem I'm certainly qualified to talk about. I'm Nick Rich. I work for Exterro, and we're we call ourselves a software platform for legal GRC. So we cover a pretty wide waterfront of capability, mostly designed to help the general counsel in a corporate sleep better at night, and I'll go no further on that. I think what I've been seeing recently is there's kind of a super cycle going on, and I have a lot of conversations of this sort, that when GDPR came in a few years ago, everybody put something together, right? And it may have been chewing gum and bits of string in a spreadsheet, it may have been some relatively sophisticated software. It was something, and it did the job, and it got you to compliance in that sort of first few stages. And now I think people are looking at that system and thinking, first of all, my data estate has changed a lot. Everyone's still hoarding data, so it's much, much bigger and more complicated than it was a few years ago. That system is probably showing some sort of aging pains and so on. But also, we've learned a great deal about what works and what doesn't. And one of the things is that data privacy and GDPR shouldn't be kind of a silo of activity. We've got a data life cycle in our organization, and we understand better now how data is created, what we need to do with it through its useful life, and then, more importantly, how do we get rid of it at the end of its useful life, and how do we identify when that is? And so a lot of the conversations I'm having at the moment are very much on that basis of how do we tie together our GDPR effort with our larger data lifecycle effort? And if that chime, perhaps a show of hands to say, you know, does that chime with this particular audience?
Yep.
Great, a few of you.
Great. So, I mean, I've got a couple of things I'd like to probe, but first of which is this observation. I, too, am a hoarder. You're a beginner if you've only been storing data that long. I have day books going back to my first day of work 40 years ago. I did until my wife made me throw them out, but I actually transferred them all electronically before I did that. So I'm not OCD, I'm CDO. That's like OCD, but in alphabetical order. So I tag everything. And sometimes that data is useful. And I kept a lot of it because I thought, well, you know, what worked, what didn't work, why I thought that was the case. It might come useful in the future. Most of it hasn't. It took up shelf space. And it was complicated to find stuff because it was, I came across that a few years ago. I'm not sure when, so you have to trawl through the darn lot. That's one of the advantages of electronic media, by the way. You can tag it. You can have metadata to help you find that. But there are risks with hoarding data. We've just heard about a great one from Camilla. We take aged data, we use it as a training set for AI. It comes to a suite of conclusions that we then rely on, and we make business decisions based upon data which is out of date and no longer representative of the world we find ourselves in. But what are some of the other risks of hoarding data? Because I don't think we're alone here. I think we look around the room. Most of us have got data somewhere, and most of us have got colleagues who have fiefdoms about they protect their little bit of data. This is my job protection scheme. I'm the only one that knows how this works.
I think that's exactly right. And from a corporate point of view, there's an asymmetrical risk. I mean, if you're the person who destroys some data that the CEO then says the next day, where was that letter? You know, that's bad. So there may be risks for the corporate in keeping it, but there are a few risks for the employee in keeping it. And so there's this asymmetry that makes it very, very difficult for corporates actually to get rid of data ever. I think there are three main risks. I mean, the first is simply the cost of storage, and that can balloon. You know, I'm working with a bank at the moment that is sort of hiring its renting out its third warehouse for the paper that it generates still, despite being in, what we think of as a very electronic world. And that seems counterproductive in many ways. So there's just a large cost element. The second is that that data can be used against you one day, right? So in there is all kinds of stuff that you don't know. And at the moment, you have a warrant to get rid of it. And if you don't, and a litigation comes down the track, it's all discoverable, right? So just to be clear, I am absolutely not suggesting that once the litigation is in view, everyone quickly deletes the emails that say, let's do a fraud, right? Exactly. Completely not the right thing to do. But before litigation is in view, you have every right to get rid of data that you no longer need or it's out of compliance and so on. And therefore you should, because it's only carrying risk of being evidence against you in some matter or another down the line, right? So that's the second risk. And of course, the third risk is now fines, right? So you can look at Viking Lines last December had a really substantial fine from the Finnish DPO for over retention of data, and it wasn't much data. This was the thing. It was employee records where they'd asked about medical history at the time of joining, had kept that form, is there anything we need to know about? It was completely benign, do we need to build a ramp net and that sort of stuff. But they'd kept that, and they'd managed to keep that data without deleting it for about 20 years. And so a lot of it was now outdated and actually incorrect health information about the employees because their conditions had changed in the meantime. And when the Finnish DPO looked at that, they said, this absolutely shouldn't have happened, quite rightly, and imposed a fairly hefty fine. And I think there are now over a dozen over retention of data fines sitting in that wonderful database of GDPR fines that we can all go and look at for Schadenfreude purposes every so often. So those are, I think, the three risks that really leap out at me for not getting rid of the data you should be getting rid of. So.
Yeah, and I think I'll add one thing to that, and it is just an addition to that point. If you store it somewhere, that is potentially vulnerable to somebody being able to access it. You're responsible for looking after all that data, irrespective of how old it is.
Yeah.
And quite a lot of that data, that old data, does contain sensitive information and we all know there are bad actors out there who would love to get hold of that. And if it's an unprotected ancient database sitting somewhere that you've overlooked and forgotten about, well, they'll find it. And once they do, they use it. And then you get the horror stories appear in the front page of the financial press. Yeah. Such and such an organization, big data breach. I've just been informed of a data breach of an organization that manages passwords. Can you imagine what that's doing to people right now? Every password I stored in that password logging site has now been potentially exposed. And I don't know about you, but I tend to use predictable passwords if you know the algorithm that I use. So, because I had a data protection officer, an IT specialist, who said, well, we need to protect all this stuff. What we're going to do is introduce a policy where every 3 months you have to come up with a new 16-digit, entirely random string of letters and numbers and special characters as a password. Do you know what we all did? We wrote them all down, because you can never remember all of those, and it wouldn't let you use previous passwords. Horrible policy. We thought it was doing the right thing for security, actually had all these unintended consequences of exposing us in another field.
Actually, can I just interject on that? There's a great cartoonist, XKCD, and he did one on exactly this and said, the password with the number and the exclamation mark at the end and all the rest of it is actually about 22 bits of entropy, typically. If you just choose 4 English words, memorable English words, you get about 54 bits of entropy. You're more than 1,000 years less likely for someone to be able to crack your password. So all those well-meaning IT bots who say, you must have numbers and other characters are harking completely up the wrong tree, exactly as you say. It should be memorable words, just a lot of them, 4 words or more. Yeah. And then your password is actually pretty secure. So.
A short sentence that's meaningful to you but not likely to be discoverable elsewhere.
Yeah.
Once upon a time, probably won't do it. So think
Yes.
about a memorable phrase for you that is unlikely to be there. So now you talked about an interesting thing here about we need to clear out the houses, and there's another reason why we'll do that. I'll come to that in a moment. A retention policy. I don't know how many people have that, have an expressed policy about this is how long we store data for, this is what we do with it, and this is how we then remove it when we no longer have a use for it. So tell me a little bit more about putting a retention policy in place or a retention schedule. You know, should we have different timelines for different kinds of data, personally identifiable data versus perhaps something that's a little bit more generic or publicly available?
Absolutely. Well, and let's throw that over. I mean, can we, again, have a show of hands? How many of you know that you've got a retention schedule? Good. And that's excellent.
You're asking the right audience,
Yeah,
by
yeah,
the
no,
way.
well, exactly so. And of course, there should be one. And you know, you've got to consider the various types of information that you're. Yes, that you've got to consider the various types of information that your organisation holds, right? So there's going to be particular data that comes under particular pieces of compliance legislation, pension information, healthcare information, and so on and so forth. But going back to you know, your last guest and the whole problem of unstructured data, that's where the real problem is, right? So you know, maybe you're in a business with 5,000 colleagues or 10,000 colleagues, and everyone's got a OneDrive or a G Drive or some kind of cloud storage that they can fill up, or worse than that, even the C drives on their corporate laptops, right? I'm sure nobody's putting anything on the C drive on their corporate laptop anymore.
Never happens.
No. But of course, you know, retention policies need to apply to that stuff just as much. And it's so easy, isn't it, that you know, you download something from your intranet to read, you use it in the course of your daily work, it's stored on your OneDrive, you move on to something else, it's still there 6 months later, it's still there 6 years later. And so having the retention schedule well defined is one big problem. But of course, the next problem is actually implementing, making sure that you're keeping to it. And I mean, I won't preempt, but you know, when we get there, let's do a show of hands of how many people think their retention schedule is provably effective. And I think
Well, let's do that right now. Put your hands up, and we're amongst friends. Nobody's taking names and kicking ass afterwards. But how many of you think you can prove that your retention policy is being executed in the way that it was intended? Go on, put your hand up if that's the case. Yeah. So why am I not surprised? Okay, so the world is, well, the road to hell is paved with good intentions or good policies. So that's an interesting question, but I think it's partly, do people know that there's a retention policy? But perhaps more important, do people care? So let me ask you about that. How do we make sure that people know, and how do we make sure that people care about this? Because it's convenience for many people, as you say. I'll just store that as a PDF on my C drive. I can read it on the train on the way home. I don't care about who's reading over my shoulder, but how do I make sure that people care? This is a discussion about security as well. And
absolutely. I've always thought there'd be a great business to be made in effectively living on the first-class carriage of the London to Edinburgh train with a microphone, just recording
if you're a
every,
Russian spy,
every conversation. That's
Salisbury
had,
to Waterloo is the one you want to be
right. Yeah, exactly. You know, so it is astonishing what you can see over people's shoulders on the train, isn't it? And I would encourage everyone to invest in one of those things you put over your screen that stops everyone else being able to see it from the side. But the how do you care is really cultural, isn't it? I years ago in a previous life was working with a company that wanted to ensure that everyone tagged their email properly for exactly this purpose, right? So they said, you know, we need this unstructured data to be properly tagged. And so this was back in the days of Lotus Notes, so I'm showing my age now as well. And so, you know, every time you sent an email, we built this thing where you sort of popped up a form and you had to sort of tag the tags that your email might come under.
I bet everybody religiously filled that in.
Well, I mean, there was nothing you could do about it at first until there was almost a general strike in that business, because people said, I can't do my daily work. Every time I send an email, I'm being asked to tick 5 or 6 boxes here. It's ridiculous. And so that had very rapidly to be taken away, right? So, but then you're back in the problem of, okay, how do I tag this data and how do I get people to take that seriously? And that's got to be, the real skill is bringing business leaders along with you as privacy professionals, right? And exposing what you do to them on a weekly and daily basis so that they understand the import of, you're not just the privacy person in the privacy cupboard. What you're doing is affecting the future of the company, right? You're saving the company from GDPR fines. You're ensuring that the company is doing the right thing with the data that it's doing. It's an ethics issue as well as a legal issue, of course. And so that's that kind of cultural change, I think, very much has to be driven from the top. There has to be buy-in from senior leadership teams. And it's very much the job of privacy professionals to go and persuade and use their advocacy to persuade senior leadership teams to drive that cultural change through an organization. So.
Yeah, and there's a couple of things that, one of the advantages of getting old is I've been around the block a couple of times. I tend to see things. So some of the things I found was that you mentioned talking to leadership. Do they understand the problem? But also, do they understand the consequences? Now, let's be honest, most leaders, most organizations do risk evaluations. What's the risk? What's the consequence? So what's the likelihood? Second order effects like reputational damage, getting a fine from a regulator, and honestly, some of these fines are nowhere near as big as the potential savings of just ignoring it. Okay, that's one story. It doesn't tend to actually work terribly well with many leaders. Think, oh, it's never going to happen here. If it does, we'll just weather the storm. Much more important to them is, well, what if you're unable to run the business for a period of time because we have to fix the problem that's found by the regulator? So we can't do business for days, weeks, months until we fix it, but also making it real and relevant to individual people. What if it was you? How this will affect you as an individual? Because the abstraction of a company, I was employed for a long time. I was a corporate animal for 35 years. Honestly, I don't really care about whatever the top executive's bonus is and how that impacts that. I'm just a little worker bee doing my thing. I wanted to know, like the notice notes, does it make my life easier or harder? And what does that mean to me at a human level? So we go back to Carl's point about the unstructured data. Tell me a story about that, how it affects me or somebody I care or love or have at the forefront of my mind. But I think it's this thing that we underestimate the consequences, direct first-order consequences of the business of not taking this seriously. It exposes us to risk from attack from other actors from outside. Cost of storage are going down. Let's be honest, you can throw it up there on the cloud, which is great, by the way, until you do analytics on it and you go and bring all that data back. That's when Amazon, as they go, wow, that's brilliant. We love you taking on board terabytes of data and doing that every time you want to do a major analysis. Please, have at it. Here's the bill. So I think that we're in this world where we've got a lot of risk that's out there. We've got a lot of data which we don't really know what it stores. Anybody doing data redaction on unstructured data? It's bloody hard, right? You've got to find did they reveal a telephone number, a medical condition, the name of somebody else? It's all in there, in that unstructured data. And if you haven't sucked it out and redacted it, and it comes up somewhere else, you've broken privacy regulations. And redaction is very difficult. But if you don't do it, the consequences can be dire.
Absolutely. But look, I think the other thing is this. My belief is most senior leadership teams are not simply concerned to, obey the letter of the law and step over the line where they can get away with it. I don't think that's the way most British companies work. And actually, there's a huge ethical dimension here. You talked about earlier data as the crude oil. That's a silly joke about crude oil and refined oil that every 6-year-old tells. And that's true. But data also belongs to your clients, your customers, right? That's what you're doing. It's
not your data.
It's not your data. It's their data, and you're taking it on trust. And they may have all kinds of unreasonable, unrealistic, uncomprehending expectations about what you're going to do with that data. But you really need not to break their trust as a corporate. And that's the thing to get across to a senior leadership team, I think, is that because once you do that, then it becomes an ethical problem. And I think most companies want to be ethical companies, don't they? They want within the bounds of profitability and reasonableness to do the right thing, as well as simply to meet the letter of the law. And I think those sorts of arguments can be incredibly powerful, and telling the stories, as you say, about the real impacts that the misuse of data and not looking after data properly and losing data out the back. I mean, your example of the risk of data breach is an excellent one. You know, if you do expose your customers to those risks, then what does that make you? You know, and I think it's not just you know, you might get a €100 fine from a relatively toothless regulator in some jurisdiction or other, but much more that actually we're taking this data on trust from our customers. It's about our reputation with them and how we look after them.
And it's interesting, I'll finish on this final observation. You mentioned trust. All the research says that since the 1970s, trust in established institutions has been collapsing. Just look at the number of people that go to Dr. Google to diagnose themselves. They don't listen to doctors, they go and look about other people, influencers commenting on medicines. And there's the old axiom, trust arrives on foot and leaves on a horse. It takes years to build up trust, and it's very easy to break it, and instantaneously you've lost that relationship. And human beings, we like to trust other people. And you say, we give other organizations our data on trust, but we're getting more reticent to do it. So I don't know about anybody else here, but I'm one of those people that when it comes up with the privacy notice and permissions, I routinely go, no, none of this. You know, I will accept the fact that I get crap advertising that isn't targeted to what I do because I don't trust you with my data. Because I don't know what you're going to do with it. And I don't know how long it's going to be there. And as some of the people have found on social media, things you said a decade ago come around and bite you in the backside. Just when you... Now, most of us have changed quite a lot in a decade. You know, I used to have a full head of hair. No, I didn't. I started losing my hair when I was 20. But I think that that's really, you know, this important thing that it was true then. And we had a good reason to use it then. But that was then. And this is now. And perhaps one of the things that for me as a data science professional is interesting is it also describes a world that doesn't exist anymore. So even if it was true then, it's actually a completely different world we find ourselves in. Anyway, with that, please join me in thanking Nick. Nick, great point. And as with all of our speakers, please do take the time to go and check out their booths in the exhibition area, nail their feet to the floor, get them to answer some specific questions. I say I'm not twisting anybody's arm up between their shoulder blades to get them to reveal confidences. But what we're going to do now is we're going to have a break. So thanks very much, Nick. So firstly, once again, very briefly, thank our speakers today, Camilla, Kyle, and Nick. Thanks very much. Let me take this off. So, short break next door for 15 minutes. Then we're going to go into our different tracks. So if you're with me, I'm going to be in the Princess Suite behind us. So that's the CIO CISO track. In the Royal Suite, sorry, not the Princess Suite. DPO track, please go to the Premier Suite. So I think that's the one upstairs. And the CMO track, please head to the Director Suite. That's upstairs. Honestly, I can't remember, so do check the signage. But you've got 15 minutes, grab a quick coffee, have a quick chat, check out our exhibitors, and then I'll see you in the tracks. So until then, thank you very much. Thanks.